Washington, D.C., July 16, 1991, 10:30 p.m. A car pulls up to the entrance of Washington Hospital Center. Inside, a man shot at least 6 times. The men who brought him there drive away before anyone can ask questions. The doctors who rush to meet the car know immediately, this man is not going to make it. At approximately 1 a.m., Michael Salters is pronounced dead. He is 32 years old. In a city that has produced some of the most feared and respected street figures in American history, the death of Michael Salters stops everything. Not because of how he died, because of who he was. The Washington Post headline says it plainly, "Alleged drug figure slain on D.C. Street." But that headline misses the point entirely, because Michael Salters, the man the streets of Washington, D.C. called Fray, was not just a drug figure. He was the man that D.C.'s most dangerous men called when things were about to fall apart, when 2 kingpins were at war and bodies were about to drop across entire neighborhoods, when disputes escalated beyond what anyone could manage, when the city was about to consume itself. They called Fray, and Fray settled it, not with violence, not with threats, with the specific authority that comes from being the most respected man in a world built entirely around respect. Law enforcement officials said it themselves. His real power lay in his ability to referee turf disputes among rival drug dealers. The most powerful man in Washington, D.C.'s underground economy was not the man who moved the most product, not the man with the most bodies, not the man with the most money. It was the man everybody trusted to be fair. And on July 16, 1991, that man was ambushed at 1st and Bryant Streets Northwest, shot 6 times, left to die outside Washington Hospital Center, by a man he had already identified as a snake, a man he had already taken 10 keys from without paying, a man he had treated like a sucker. This is the story of what D.C. lost when it lost Fray, and the story of the fatal mistake that cost the city's most respected man his life. To understand what Fray was, you need to understand what Washington, D.C. was. Not the tourist version, not the White House and the monuments and the version of Washington that the government presents to the world. The real Washington, D.C. Chocolate City, the first major American city with a predominantly black population, a city with black-owned businesses, black political leadership, black cultural institutions that had been building for decades, and a city with its own underground economy, older, deeper, and more sophisticated than most Americans understood. Before the crack era hit in the mid-1980s, Washington, D.C.'s underground economy was built around numbers, heroin, and the specific organizational structures that black men in D.C. had been building since the 1940s. The men who built those structures were not just criminals, they were community figures. Men who paid rent for families who couldn't make it, who funded businesses when the bank said no, who settled disputes that the legal system either couldn't or wouldn't touch. In D.C.'s street world, power was not just about money or violence. Power was about respect. And respect, real respect, the kind that makes entire neighborhoods defer to one man's judgment, had to be earned through something that couldn't be faked. Character. Michael Salters grew up in that world. He came up through juvenile detention, through the specific hard school that D.C.'s streets run for the boys who end up inside, where the lessons are about loyalty and code and what it means to be a man in an environment designed to break men. He boxed. The Wrecking Crew, D.C.'s boxing institution, was where Fray developed the specific discipline that physical combat demands. The ability to take a hit and not fall, the patience to wait for the right moment, the understanding that power is not about how hard you swing, but about how precisely you move, Those lessons translated. From the boxing gym to the streets of Washington, D.C., Fray carried himself with the specific combination of strength and discipline that made men who were dangerous themselves stop and pay attention. He built his reputation not through spectacular violence, but through consistent excellence, through being the man who could be counted on, through being the man whose word meant something, in a world where most men's words meant nothing. By the time the 1980s arrived, Michael Fray Salters had become something that DC's street world had never fully produced before. A genuine arbiter, a judge. When two major operators in DC had a dispute, when product went missing, when money didn't come back, when territorial lines got crossed in ways that both sides were prepared to go to war over, they didn't go to war. They went to Fray, and Fray would sit with both sides, hear what each man had to say, apply the specific logic of the street code he had spent his entire life studying and understanding, and deliver a verdict. The verdict was always the same in its structure: fair. Both men walked away feeling they had been heard. Both men walked away with something. Both men walked away without having to go to war. And because both men respected Fray enough to accept his verdict, bodies didn't drop. Neighborhoods didn't get shot up. The city didn't consume itself. Law enforcement officials, who eventually described Fray's operation, acknowledged something extraordinary about it. His real power lay not in the drugs he moved, though he moved serious product, but in his ability to referee turf disputes among rival drug dealers. Think about what that means. In an underground economy built entirely on violence as the ultimate arbiter of disputes, one man was respected enough to replace the violence. His word was the law. Not because he had the most guns, because he had the most respect. He was described as a man among men, respected, feared, and loved. All three simultaneously. In a world where most men inspire one or two of those responses, Fray inspired all three. Washington, D.C. in the mid-1980s was a city generating extraordinary money. The crack epidemic that was devastating black communities across America had a specific effect on D.C.'s underground economy. It made it enormous. Overnight fortunes, product moving through neighborhoods at volumes nobody had anticipated, new operators emerging every week with ambitions that stretched beyond their experience and their understanding. All of that chaos needed management, and Fray managed it. He was connected to the city's most significant operators, Cornell Jones, who ran what law enforcement called the most significant open-air drug market in D.C.'s history on Hanover Place, nicknamed the Ghost for his ability to operate invisibly, and Eddie Mathis, the Godfather, whose name rang through D.C.'s street world with the specific weight of a man who had built and maintained power for decades. Fray moved in that company, was respected by those men, operated at their level, while maintaining the specific role that made him unique among them. He was not just a participant in DC's underground economy. He was its equilibrium, the force that kept everything from spiraling into chaos. When Kurt Bone and Rayful Edmond fell in 1989, when DC's two biggest suppliers were simultaneously taken down by federal indictments and the city went dry, it was into this vacuum that a man from East Harlem arrived. Alberto Martinez, Alpo. Alpo hit DC with kilos and game. Flossing and shining, the Dapper Dan, the cars, the women, the specific performance of wealth and power that New York operators brought with them when they came to other cities. In Harlem, that performance meant something because the men around Alpo in Harlem knew his history, knew what he had built, knew that the performance corresponded to something real. In DC, it was just a show. And Fray saw through it immediately. His attitude toward New York operators coming to D.C. was specific and documented. He despised it, not just because they were taking money out of D.C., because of what they did to the city when they came. The slick New York dudes would come down with kilos and game, flossing and shining, getting D.C. dudes to betray and murder other D.C. dudes, just destroying what had been built and then leaving the mess behind when things got hot. Fray had spent his entire career building the specific equilibrium that kept D.C. from destroying itself, and Alpo represented everything that threatened it. Fray's response was characteristically direct. He leaned on Alpo, not with a gun, not with explicit threats, with the specific muscle of his reputation. He got product from Alpo and didn't pay for it. One hustler witnessed it personally. I saw Fray take 10 keys from Alpo one time. 10 keys worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, taken without payment, as a demonstration. This is what DC is, and this is what you are in DC, a supplier, not a power. He treated Alpo like a sucker, because that is what Fray believed Alpo was. Fray was not operating blind. He had contacts in New York, men from the same world who knew Alpo's history before DC knew anything about him. They warned him. Alpo had set people up in New York, good dudes, people who trusted him. He had been operating as an informant and a manipulator long before the federal government made it official. Zebras can't change their stripes. Once a sucker, always a sucker. Fray heard the warning. He understood it. He knew what Alpo was. And that is the specific tragedy of what happened next. Because knowing what Alpo was didn't make Fray more cautious, it made him more confident. He had taken 10 keys without paying. He had leaned on the man with his full reputation. He had demonstrated in public, in front of witnesses, that Alpo was a sucker who could be handled. And DC had seen it. DC knew. Alpo had been publicly humiliated by the city's most respected man. In Fray's mind, that humiliation was the end of the situation. What he did not fully calculate was what humiliation does to a man who has nothing but ego to protect. A man with no real code. A man who understood that his reputation, the only thing he had brought to DC from New York, was now damaged beyond repair. That man does not accept the humiliation and move on. That man calculates. Alpo found out that Fray was planning to kill him. He said it himself, in his own words, in an interview with Feds magazine that documented everything. Fray was about to get back in position in DC. He had a list of names or people he needed to eliminate, and I was at the top of his list. I found out because I was feeding someone in his camp he wasn't taking care of. That same person ended up killing him for me. Read that sentence carefully. A man in Fray's own camp. Someone Fray trusted enough to be inside his circle. Someone Fray had not taken care of properly, had not paid what was owed, had not maintained the relationship that loyalty requires. That man was talking to Alpo. Alpo paid Michael Jackson, a DC man connected to the murder, $9,000 in cash, a half kilogram of cocaine, a 9mm handgun, $9,000, a half a kilo, a gun. That was the price Alpo put on the life of DC's most respected street legend. Wayne Perry, known as Silk, the most feared enforcer in DC's history, was also involved in the plot. Perry confirmed it himself in Don Diva magazine years later. As far as the Fray thing, I'm going to tell you about it. I wouldn't if it could get someone in trouble, but the rat already told it. That was a cruddy snake move. Even Wayne Perry, a man who had committed more violence than most people can imagine, called it a cruddy snake move because Fray was not killed in a fair confrontation. He was not killed by a man with a legitimate grievance who had challenged him openly. He was betrayed from inside his own circle by someone he trusted, set up by a man he had correctly identified as a snake, and killed because he had underestimated what a snake without honor will do when cornered. July 16th, 1991, Washington, D.C. Fray is driving. A relative is in a van behind him, driving east on Bryant, connected to Fray in the specific way that men who trust their family trust no one else. Near First Street, another car cuts off the van behind Fray. From that cutting car, gunfire. The ambush is over in seconds. The car that cut off the van disappears. The relative in the van sees what has happened to Fray's car. They drive Fray to Washington Hospital Center. They leave him at the entrance. 10:30 p.m. Fray has been shot at least 6 times. At approximately 1 a.m., Michael Salters is pronounced dead. The city that he had spent his entire career protecting from itself goes quiet, then goes loud with grief. "I was in prison when Fray got killed," his relative said later. "I'll never forget when someone came to my cell and told me your cousin got killed last night. I got on the phone and called home and couldn't believe it. I wondered who would jump out there like that. Fray had that much pull in D.C. It hurts to even talk about this shit because nothing was really done to answer that shit. How can a man like Fray get killed and nobody tears the city up and goes to war?" The answer, the specific, devastating answer, was that nobody knew who did it. Alpo had used a man from inside Fray's own circle, a man nobody would suspect. "If the ambassador of Chocolate City could be touched," one source said, "then anyone could be touched." It was a sobering reality. Fray's nephew, Darrell Salters, the streets called him Poochie, was a stick-up kid. When the news of Fray's murder reached Poochie, he did what nephews who loved their uncles do in D.C.'s street world. He went looking for answers. He found some. He allegedly killed several people in retaliation for Fray's murder. Men who were connected to what happened on First and Bryant Streets Northwest. Men who may or may not have been the right targets. In D.C.'s street world, the geography of retaliation is not always precise. Poochie was eventually gunned down himself. The nephew who tried to avenge the uncle, gone. 2 Salters, 2 generations, both taken by the same violent world that Michael Fray Salters had spent his career trying to manage. On March 5, 1993, a 27-count federal indictment stemming from the Alpo investigation alleged that Alpo's crew was responsible for 9 homicides between 1989 and 1991. Fray's murder was among them. The allegations that Alpo and Wayne Perry had paid $9,000 in cash, a half kilo of cocaine, and a 9mm handgun to have Michael Salters killed were never formally presented in court. But Alpo confirmed them himself, in print, in Feds magazine, to a writer who documented everything, the rat who had destroyed D.C.'s underground economy by setting up and snitching on the people around him, voluntarily confirmed that he had arranged the murder of the city's most respected man for $9,000 and a half kilo. That was the price. Washington, D.C. lost something on July 16, 1991, that it never fully replaced. Not just a person, a system, the specific organizational intelligence that Michael Fray Salters represented. The ability to sit across from 2 dangerous men, hear both sides, and deliver a verdict that both sides would accept is extraordinarily rare. It exists in legitimate institutions, in courts, in arbitration, in the specific apparatus of law that democratic societies build to prevent disputes from turning into violence. It almost never exists in the underground economy. Where it does exist, it is usually destroyed quickly, because the men who would benefit from chaos always outnumber the men who would benefit from order. Fray maintained that order for years. He did it without a law degree, without institutional authority, without the power of a state behind him. He did it with character. And when he was gone, DC had no replacement. The city that Fray had spent his career protecting from itself proceeded to become exactly what he had feared. The crack era's most violent years came after his death. The body count climbed. The disputes that Fray would have refereed went unresolved. The chaos that he had contained spilled into every neighborhood. DC became the murder capital of America, in large part because the man who had kept it from tearing itself apart was no longer there. And the man who killed him, who paid $9,000 plus a half kilogram to remove the city's most respected man, eventually cooperated with the federal government, gave up everyone around him, entered witness protection, moved through the world for another 30 years under someone else's name. Until Halloween night 2021, when Harlem found him on Frederick Douglass Boulevard, and finally closed the account. Michael Fray Salters, the judge of Washington, D.C.'s underground economy, the man who kept the city from destroying itself, killed by a snake he had already identified, betrayed by someone he trusted, gone at 32 years old, and never replaced. Subscribe to Bloody Reports. There are 1,000 stories like this one that nobody has told the right way yet. This was one of them.